Imagine facing an enemy so vast their camels were like grains of sand, and their warriors covered the valley like locusts. Now imagine God telling you to fight them, with only 300 men. This is the jaw-dropping, faith-filled story of Gideon, the man who trusted God against impossible odds and won one of the most legendary battles in history. If you love powerful Bible stories of faith and courage, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you never miss a life-changing story. In ancient Israel, during a time of oppression, the Midianites raided the land relentlessly. Crops were destroyed, livestock stolen, and the people of Israel lived in fear. They cried out to the Lord, desperate for deliverance. It was in these dark times that God chose an unlikely man, Gideon, a humble farmer hiding in a winepress to thresh wheat. As Gideon worked in secret, the angel of the Lord appeared to him, greeting him with a surprising title, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon, confused, questioned why God had abandoned Israel. The angel reassured him, God had chosen Gideon to deliver his people from the Midianites. Gideon doubted his worth, reminding the angel that his family was the weakest in Manasseh, and he was the least in his household. But God's call was firm, "I will be with you and you will strike down all the Midianites together." With trembling faith, Gideon asked for a sign to confirm this divine mission. Gideon prepared an offering, meat, bread, and broth, and placed them on a rock at the angel's instruction. The angel touched it with the tip of his staff, and fire flared from the rock, consuming the offering. Instantly, Gideon realized he had seen the angel of the Lord and feared for his life, but God spoke peace to him. That night, God gave Gideon his first mission, to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Gideon obeyed, but out of fear of the townspeople, he did it under the cover of darkness with 10 servants. In the morning, the townspeople discovered the destroyed altar and demanded Gideon's execution. But his father, Joash, defended him, saying, "If Baal is a god, let him defend himself." From that day on, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, "Let Baal contend with him." Word came that the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples had crossed the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, calling the tribes of Israel to join him for battle. Even after assembling an army, Gideon still sought assurance from God. He placed a wool fleece on the threshing floor and asked that dew fall only on the fleece and not the ground. The next morning the fleece was soaked but the ground was dry. Gideon asked for one more sign. This time the fleece remained dry while the ground was covered in dew. With this confirmation, Gideon prepared for war, his faith now strengthened by God's undeniable signs. God then gave Gideon a strange command, to reduce his army. From 32,000 men, only 10,000 remained after sending home those who were afraid. But God said, "There are still too many." God told Gideon to bring the men to the water for a final test. Those who lapped the water with their tongues like dogs were set apart from those who knelt to drink. Only 300 men drank by lapping, and God said, "With the 300 who lapped I will save you." God sent the rest of the army home. Gideon now faced a massive Midianite force with only 300 soldiers. But the Lord promised, "I will give the Midianites into your hands." Gideon's heart was still steady, because God's voice was his assurance. That night, God told Gideon to go down to the Midianite camp if he was afraid, and listen to what they were saying. Taking his servant Purah, Gideon crept to the edge of the camp and overheard a soldier telling a dream of a barley loaf tumbling into the Midianite camp, overturning a tent. The soldier's comrade interpreted the dream, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites into his hands." Encouraged by this, Gideon returned to his camp ready to act. Gideon divided his 300 men into 3 companies. Each man was given a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. This was no ordinary battle plan, it was God's strategy to confuse and terrify the enemy. As the Midianites slept, Gideon and his men took their positions around the camp. At the signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and revealed the blazing torches, shouting, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Midianite camp erupted in confusion. In the darkness, they turned their swords on each other, thinking they were under attack from all sides. Fear and chaos spread like wildfire. The Lord caused the Midianites to flee toward the Jordan River. Gideon sent messengers to rally the other tribes, telling them to seize the river crossings and cut off their escape. The men of Ephraim captured the waters of the Jordan and seized 2 Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeb. They killed them and brought their heads to Gideon, marking a decisive victory. Even after this victory, the pursuit continued. Gideon and his 300, exhausted but determined, crossed the Jordan chasing 2 Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. They stopped at the towns of Succos and Peniel, asking for bread for their exhausted men. But the leaders refused, mocking Gideon's mission since he had not yet captured the kings. Despite the insult, Gideon pressed on and surprised the Midianite kings in Karkar, defeating their remaining forces. Zebah and Zalmunna were captured alive. Gideon returned to Succos and Peniel with the captured kings, punishing the towns for their refusal to help. Justice was served and the kings were executed for their crimes against Israel. With Israel finally at peace, the people wanted Gideon to rule over them. But Gideon refused, declaring, "The Lord will rule over you." His humility marked his leadership as divinely guided. Gideon lived out his days in peace, but after his death, Israel quickly turned back to idolatry. Yet the memory of the man who defeated an army with 300 soldiers lives on as a testament to what God can do with faithful obedience. The time of Gideon was during the era of the Judges, a chaotic period in Israel's history when there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The Midianite oppression was a direct consequence of Israel's disobedience to God, as they had turned to worship false gods like Baal and Asherah. The Midianites, nomadic raiders from the east, would descend on Israel during harvest, stealing crops and livestock, leaving the land barren. They were not a small band of thieves. They were a massive coalition, their camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore, their warriors covering entire valleys. Understanding this historical backdrop makes Gideon's story even more remarkable. This was not just a small-scale skirmish. It was a clash between an impoverished, oppressed nation and a vast, militarily superior enemy. The fact that God chose a timid, self-doubting man like Gideon to lead this deliverance shows that the victory was never meant to glorify human strength. Instead, it was to display God's power in the face of overwhelming odds. Gideon's rise from an ordinary farmer to a national deliverer is a story of transformation, proving that God does not call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Gideon's initial call in the winepress reveals much about God's way of working. In human eyes, Gideon was hiding, fearful, and unremarkable, hardly the kind of man you'd expect to lead a national liberation movement. But God called him mighty warrior, before he had even drawn a sword. This teaches us that God speaks to our identity in Him, not merely our current circumstances. Gideon's doubts and questions were not ignored. In fact, God engaged with them patiently, providing signs and reassurances. The fire that consumed Gideon's offering was a visible confirmation that God Himself was commissioning him. This moment was transformative. Gideon moved from being a passive victim of oppression to an active participant in God's deliverance plan. The destruction of Baal's altar that followed was significant too. Before Gideon could confront the enemy outside, he had to confront idolatry within his own community. This principle still applies today. Before we can address the external challenges in life, we often need to deal with the internal ones, the compromises, fears, and misplaced trusts in our hearts. The reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 men remains one of the most counterintuitive military decisions in history. Any military strategist of the time would have called it madness. But God's reasoning was clear. If Israel won with a large army, they might boast that their own strength saved them. By stripping the army down to a mere 300, there could be no doubt that the victory came from the Lord. The method of choosing these men, based on how they drank water, may seem unusual, but it separated the vigilant from the careless. Those who lapped water from their hands kept their eyes up, aware of their surroundings, while those who knelt down became more vulnerable. God's choice was intentional, selecting men who would remain alert, disciplined, and ready. This was not about numbers. It was about quality, readiness, and faith. In our own lives, we often think we need more resources, more people, or more advantages to succeed. But Gideon's army reduction teaches that God can accomplish great things with less than we think, if we are willing to trust Him. The victory was not in the size of the army, but in the size of their God. The dream overheard in the Midianite camp was no coincidence. Dreams held cultural significance in the ancient Near East, often seen as divine messages. For a Midianite soldier to dream of a barley loaf rolling into their camp and toppling a tent was symbolic. Barley was considered the food of the poor, representing something humble and ordinary. In this dream it represented Israel, small, humble and seemingly insignificant, toppling the tent which symbolized the Midianite power. The interpretation by the other soldier confirmed what God was orchestrating. Fear was already seated in the enemy's camp. God was at work long before the first trumpet blew or the first jar shattered. Sometimes, the victory begins long before the actual battle in ways we cannot see. God can plant seeds of confusion and fear in the enemy's mind, paving the way for his people's triumph. Gideon's encouragement from this overheard conversation shows how even small reassurances at the right moment can ignite courage. When Gideon returned to his men, his confidence was no longer rooted in signs alone but in the certainty of God's unfolding plan. The battle strategy Gideon implemented was unlike anything seen in conventional warfare. Dividing his 300 men into 3 companies, arming each with a trumpet, a torch and a clay jar, was a psychological tactic designed to create the illusion of a much larger force. In the dead of night, the sudden sound of hundreds of trumpets, the smashing of jars and the sudden blaze of torches surrounding the camp would create chaos. To the Midianites, this would have seemed like a coordinated multi-front attack by a massive army. Panic is a powerful weapon, and God used it to dismantle a numerically superior enemy without a traditional fight. This moment also teaches that God's strategies often defy human logic. Victory was achieved not through swords or chariots, but through obedience, timing, and divine intervention. Gideon's 300 men didn't have to overpower the enemy, they had to obey God's unusual plan and let him fight the battle. As the trumpets blared and the torches lit the darkness, chaos erupted within the Midianite camp. In the confusion, the soldiers began striking one another, mistaking friend for foe. This was more than mere panic. It was God's hand causing disarray. The Bible often records such divine interventions in battle, where the enemy is thrown into confusion, making them vulnerable without the need for direct combat. This ensured that the victory could not be attributed to military skill but to God's power alone. The scene would have been unforgettable. Tents collapsing, men shouting in fear, camels breaking loose and stampeding, weapons clashing in the dark. It was a victory unfolding before the 300 even moved into the camp. For Gideon and his men, this was a moment to stand firm, hold their positions and witness God's salvation. There's a powerful lesson here. Sometimes our role is not to fight frantically but to stand where God has placed us and trust Him to act. The pursuit that followed was relentless. As the Midianites fled toward the Jordan, Gideon called upon the tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh to join the chase. The tribe of Ephraim was tasked with seizing the river crossings to cut off the enemy's escape. Their success in capturing and killing the Midianite princes Oreb and Zeb dealt a crushing blow to the enemy's morale. This moment in the story underscores the importance of unity among God's people. Though Gideon's 300 were the central figures, the victory involved multiple tribes working together. In spiritual battles, the body of believers must act in unity, each playing their role. Some may be on the front lines, others guarding key positions, but all contribute to the victory God brings. When Gideon and his men crossed the Jordan in pursuit of Zebah and Zalmunna, they were exhausted yet determined. These were not fresh troops. They had been up through the night, executing a dangerous battle plan and chasing a fleeing enemy across rough desert terrain. When they reached Sukkot, a fortified town, they requested bread for their weary soldiers. Instead of hospitality, they were met with skepticism and arrogance. The leaders of Sukkot refused, taunting Gideon for not yet having the Midianite kings in custody. This was more than just a refusal of food, it was a refusal to support God's deliverance. It revealed the cowardice and self-preservation of a people unwilling to take risks for the Lord's cause. The same thing happened in Peniel, where their tower symbolized human pride and false security. These towns serve as a reminder that neutrality in the face of God's work is itself a choice, and often the wrong one. Gideon's response was not out of petty vengeance but justice. Leaders who refuse to aid God's deliverance undermine the unity and security of God's people. The ambush at Karkar was a masterstroke of timing and endurance. Gideon pressed forward with his 300 despite fatigue, catching Zebah and Zalmunna's remaining forces off guard. The Midianite army had scattered after their initial defeat, and the remnants likely believed they had escaped. But Gideon struck swiftly, overwhelming the unsuspecting camp. The capture of the two kings was not just a symbolic victory, it marked the complete dismantling of Midianite leadership. This was the moment Israel's long years of humiliation came to an end. The courage to pursue when tired, to fight when drained, is a hallmark of faith-driven perseverance. Often spiritual breakthroughs come after the point where we feel we have nothing left to give. Gideon's relentless pursuit teaches that when God is with us, our strength can be renewed to finish the task. Returning to Succoth and Peniel with the captured kings was a moment of accountability. Gideon confronted the leaders who had refused him, showing that their lack of faith had been misplaced. At Succoth he disciplined the elders with thorns and briars, a symbolic act of correction. In Peniel he tore down their tower, the very thing they had trusted instead of God. These actions may seem harsh by modern standards, but in the ancient context, they served as a deterrent to future betrayal and a public statement that God's mission could not be hindered by internal disloyalty. For the watching Israelites, this was a sobering reminder that God's work demands both courage and unity. It is not enough to simply witness deliverance. One must also be willing to stand with those God has appointed to bring it. The execution of Zebah and Zalmunna was not only retribution for their oppression of Israel but also personal justice. The kings had killed Gideon's brothers at Tabor, making their deaths a matter of both national and family honor. In ancient warfare, kings were not just political leaders but often warlords responsible for atrocities. By executing them, Gideon ensured the Midianite threat was eradicated at its root. This act also reflected the biblical principle that those who shed innocent blood are held accountable. For Gideon, this was the closing chapter of a God-ordained mission that began with fear in a winepress and ended with a decisive victory over an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The land would have peace for 40 years after this, a testament to the completeness of the deliverance. After the war, the Israelites sought to make Gideon their ruler, offering him and his descendants a dynastic kingship. Gideon's refusal was significant. "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you," he declared. This statement preserved the theocratic nature of Israel's leadership during the time of the judges. Gideon recognized that true deliverance and guidance came from God, not human authority. In an age when kingship was often seen as the pinnacle of success, Gideon's humility stood out. However, his later actions, creating an ephod from the gold plunder, would have unintended consequences. Though perhaps intended as a memorial to God's victory, the ephod became a snare, leading Israel back into idolatry. It's a cautionary tale that even great victories can be followed by spiritual pitfalls if the glory is not fully given to God. The 40 years of peace under Gideon's leadership were a rare season of stability in Israel's turbulent history. Without foreign invasions or major internal conflicts, the land flourished. Yet this peace was fragile, dependent on the people's faithfulness to God. The cycle of the Judges period, sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and peace, would tragically repeat after Gideon's death. His story serves as both inspiration and warning. While one man's faith can ignite a nation's deliverance, lasting change requires the collective heart of the people to remain aligned with God. Gideon's life encapsulates both the heights of trust and the dangers of complacency. His victories were monumental, but the spiritual legacy was mixed, a reflection of the human condition that still resonates today. Gideon's story leaves us with one of the most striking portraits of human faith mixed with human weakness. He was called while hiding, chosen despite his fears, and empowered to do the impossible. Through him, God showed that he does not need the strong, the numerous, or the impressive to bring victory, only the willing. Yet Gideon's later years show the dangers of misplaced devotion. The ephod he made became an object of worship, drawing Israel's heart away from God. It's a reminder that even spiritual leaders must guard against pride and unintended idolatry. A life that starts with humility and dependence on God can stumble if the focus shifts from God's glory to personal legacy. Gideon's victories inspire courage. His missteps warn of the need for vigilance even after the battle is won. The people of Israel, in their gratitude for deliverance, often shifted their focus from God to the human leader he used. Gideon's refusal of kingship was noble, but their veneration of him and his ephod hinted at a deeper problem: a tendency to put faith in visible symbols instead of the unseen God. In our lives, we may also elevate spiritual leaders, traditions, or symbols to a place only God should occupy. Gideon's story reminds us to appreciate those God uses without confusing them with the one who truly saves. It is a fine line between honor and idolatry, and Israel's history shows how quickly that line can be crossed. True worship must always point beyond the messenger to the message, beyond the servant to the master. As years passed, the memory of God's miraculous deliverance began to fade for the next generation. Without constant remembrance and teaching, the awe of God's power can grow dim. This is why God had commanded Israel to tell his works to their children, to write his words on their doorposts, to set up memorials. The ephod should have been such a memorial, but it became a stumbling block instead. Gideon's lifetime saw peace, but after his death the people returned to Baal worship. It is one of the most tragic patterns in Scripture. Peace leads to prosperity, prosperity to forgetfulness, forgetfulness to rebellion, and rebellion to disaster. Gideon's life urges us to remember and retell God's faithfulness so it is never forgotten. In the New Testament, Gideon's name appears in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. Alongside Abraham, Moses, and David, Gideon is honored for his trust in God. This recognition is profound. It means that despite his fears, doubts, and later mistakes, God saw his faith as genuine. Gideon's inclusion reminds us that biblical heroes are not flawless. Their greatness lies not in perfection but in trust and obedience when it mattered most. God measures faith not by the absence of weakness, but by the willingness to step forward despite it. For anyone who feels inadequate or unqualified, Gideon stands as proof that God delights in using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From a historical perspective, Gideon's victory over the Midianites reshaped the balance of power in the region. The Midianites, once a dominating force, never regained their strength. Israel, though still vulnerable, enjoyed a season of freedom. Gideon's unconventional warfare strategy, using surprise, psychological tactics, and divine timing, would be studied by military minds for generations. But beyond strategy, it was the divine orchestration that turned the tide. History remembers many battles, but few are so clearly marked as the work of God rather than human might. The Gideon account stands as both historical record and divine testimony. Gideon's fleece test has often been discussed as an example of seeking confirmation from God. Some see it as a lack of faith, others as careful discernment. What is clear is that God met Gideon where he was in his uncertainty and answered him. This tells us something about God's character. He is patient with those who sincerely seek his will. However, the story also warns that continual testing can reflect a hesitancy to act on what God has already made clear. Faith grows not by endless signs, but by stepping forward when the signs have been given. Gideon's journey from fleece testing to fearless leading shows the transformation that comes when we move from needing proof to trusting God's word. The selection of Gideon's 300 men has a symbolic weight that goes beyond military necessity. Throughout Scripture, God often works through small numbers. David facing Goliath, Elijah against the prophets of Baal, Jesus choosing 12 disciples. This pattern shows that God's strength is magnified when human resources seem insufficient. The 300 were not the strongest or most famous. They were alert, obedient, and ready. In a world obsessed with numbers, size, and influence, God reminds us that availability matters more than ability. He doesn't need large armies, he needs surrendered hearts. Psychological warfare was at the heart of Gideon's victory. The sound of trumpets, the breaking of jars, and the sudden blaze of torches created the illusion of an overwhelming army. In the ancient world, night attacks were rare because of the confusion they caused, and Gideon exploited that perfectly. But the greater truth is that God himself confused the Midianites. The Bible often describes God as a warrior who fights for his people, sometimes in ways that bypass direct combat. It was divine panic, not Israelite swords, that destroyed the enemy. This shows that God's strategies are not bound by human rules, and they are always effective. In reflecting on Gideon's life, we see a man who began with fear but ended with courage. His story is a mirror for our own journeys, times when we feel hidden, overlooked, or inadequate. God often calls us in those moments, not when we feel ready. The key is not to wait for fear to vanish, but to move forward in obedience despite it. Gideon's transformation shows that faith is not instant. It grows as we step into God's assignments. We may start in a winepress, but with God's guidance we can lead nations to victory. The story of Gideon is more than an ancient battle account. It's a living testimony. It calls us to trust God's strength over our own, to act in unity with His people, to remember His past deliverances, and to guard against pride after victory. Whether facing external opposition or internal doubt, we can draw courage from the God who turned 300 men into a force that reshaped history. Gideon's life tells us that no one is too small, too weak, or too fearful for God to use. The question is not whether He can work through us, but whether we will say yes when He calls.